This is why bottlenecking causes your game's FPS to drop. But first, my name is Steve Smith, this is TQA Weekly, and if you haven't already done so, click the join button down below and be part of our monthly live streams as well as our private Discord channel for members only, and information on that will be in the community tab. I want you to think about something, a few things. But the first thing is video games. They're complicated. They're fun, but they're complicated. You can think of them as being an operating system. They have to deal with artificial intelligence, your characters, multiplayer, in-game items, as well as everything in the environment. They have huge worlds full of different items that are either moving around or static in place. And your computer has to keep track of everything inside of your view because it doesn't render everything in the game, it renders everything that you can see. So let's get to your computer. Your computer is likely to have a hard drive, SSD, CPU, RAM, and a graphics card. Let's start off with the order in which everything occurs. So you're either using an SSD or a hard drive to boot up into your game. The faster the drive is, the faster it will load, obviously. Your CPU will be actually executing all of the commands and processing all the information. The better the single and multi-threaded performance of your CPU, the better your experience is going to be. So we've gotten to that. If you have a fast enough hard drive or SSD and CPU, you shouldn't have too much of a problem. If you have enough RAM, which I would say 4 gigs is not enough for a gaming computer, so you're looking at 8 and preferably 16 gigs of RAM, since most people don't just game on their computer. What ends up happening is if you don't have enough RAM, it will be stored as virtual memory back onto your SSD or your hard drive, which will make it load slowly again. Up to this point, there's not too much issue because as long as the drive is being slower than the CPU, it doesn't have enough information to max out. But if the hard drive or the SSD is working too hard and the CPU and the RAM is simply waiting in idle, that is where your bottleneck would be. If you don't have enough RAM and it ends up being at 100% saturation, that is where that bottleneck will be. Now, if you're starting to process the environments in the video game and your CPU is actually executing too many commands, or what they call draw calls, for any of the individual items in the environment that you are rendering in front of your character as part of the video game's engine, then the CPU itself would be the bottleneck. You might be wondering at why I'm not talking about the graphics card itself being the bottleneck. This is because your hard drive, your SSD, your RAM, and your CPU are not meant to function at 100%. If they do, they simply have to process everything in their cache until they're capable of processing newer commands. And the more commands that are stacked up behind it, the longer it's going to take. Now, in the case of the graphics card, if it's not running at 100%, it's just waiting at idle, but it is meant to run at 100%. When the graphics card is running at 100%, it is generating the maximum amount of frames that it can. It's got one job, and it is processing the image and making it so that it is fluid on your screen. The higher the FPS, the better. Obviously, if you have too many frames per second, you'll have tearing on the screen, and you can use VSync to mitigate that issue, which brings back down the amount of processing your graphics card will do. So let's start solving some problems. So if your graphics card is having trouble rendering images because your texture quality is too high and it's giving you as many frames as you can, but it's not giving you enough frames per second, you can lower the texture quality of the actual video game or even lower the resolution in order to actually have more frames per second generated. Doing that will give you more frames per second. Now, if that's not actually the issue and your computer's just slow to send the information to the graphics card, then you have a bottleneck related to either the CPU, the RAM, the hard drive, or the SSD. And typically, if a game has too many draw calls, it's because the environment is too big. So in that case, the distance rendered in the video game is actually what you should shrink. Because if you have a distance that is smaller for it to render, there'll be fewer items to render in the video game, meaning that your CPU will be taxed less. Or you can obviously play in something like DirectX 12 or Vulkan, which will tax the CPU less anyway. Now, if you're looking at your RAM being completely saturated, your hard drive or your SSD, there might be a specific problem with either the platform or the drive themselves being too slow. Getting faster drives or more RAM will alleviate some of those issues. Now, you might be there being like, well, how do I know exactly what's going on? It's actually easier than you think. Control-Alt-Escape will bring up the task manager, and under performance, you will see the RAM, the SSDs and the hard drives, your GPU, as well as your CPU. Remember, your GPU is meant to run at 100%, but your hard drive, SSD, RAM, and CPU aren't meant to run at 100%. When those components run at 100%, information is being held behind to be processed and executed, where in the case of the graphics card, the more it is functioning and the more processing power is being used, the more frames per second it is generating. Obviously, it can be pinned at 100% and only generating 12 frames per second if you set the texture quality and the environment too high. But you can always lower that and have a better experience. But if you have too many draw calls coming off the CPU, your graphics card won't have the information and your computer itself will lag behind. This is why bottlenecking causes your FPS to drop. Because if you set your texture quality too high, your graphics card wouldn't actually be generating that many frames per second, sure, but the game itself wouldn't be slow. But if the CPU, the RAM, the hard drive, the SSD are too saturated or doing too much, that is where your game suffers. So I hope this answers your question on why bottlenecking causes your FPS to drop. Like if you liked it, dislike it if you didn't, share with those you think can benefit from this, and don't forget to subscribe. And if you have any questions, comments, suggestions for topics, email me at ask@tqaweekly.com. Go to my website, tqaweekly.com, where you can find other ways of subscribing, as well as using the contact form to email me directly, and even reading the show notes on this episode. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.